There's a reason some cases never get solved, and it's not always because the evidence isn't there. Sometimes the most critical piece of the puzzle is sitting in plain sight, documented, photographed, and filed away in a box that no one ever opens again. This is the story of a cold case that collapsed not because of a lack of clues, but because one detail was so obvious, so undeniable, that it was somehow overlooked by everyone who touched the investigation. What you're about to hear is based on real events, real people, and a truth that sat waiting in silence for over 2 decades. And the moment that truth finally surfaced, it didn't just solve a mystery. It exposed a system that had failed in ways no one wanted to admit. Her name was Rebecca Hollies, and in the spring of 1998, she was 23 years old, working 2 jobs in a small industrial town called Milford, nestled in the Rust Belt of Pennsylvania. Rebecca was known by everyone. She waited tables at the Silver Spoon Diner on weekdays and stocked shelves at the local grocery store on weekends. She had a warm smile, a loud laugh, and a habit of remembering everyone's coffee order. People liked her because she made them feel seen. She lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above a hardware store on Main Street, and she was saving money to go back to school. She wanted to be a nurse. Her life wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and she was building it one shift at a time. On the evening of April 14, 1998, Rebecca finished her shift at the diner just after 9 p.m. Her coworker, a woman named Linda, later told police that Rebecca seemed normal that night, maybe a little tired, but nothing unusual. Rebecca clocked out, grabbed her jacket, and said goodnight. Linda watched her walk out the front door and turn left toward Main Street. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Hollies alive. She never made it home. Her apartment was less than a 10-minute walk from the diner, a straight shot down a street that was quiet but not deserted. And yet, somewhere in that short distance, Rebecca vanished. By the next morning, her absence would trigger a search that would consume the town and unravel in ways no one could have predicted. When Rebecca didn't show up for her shift at the grocery store the following morning, her manager called her apartment. No answer. He tried again an hour later, still nothing. By noon, he contacted Rebecca's mother, who lived 2 towns over. Her mother, Carol, immediately drove to Milford and went straight to Rebecca's apartment. The door was locked. She knocked, called out, pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Carol used the spare key Rebecca had given her and stepped inside. The apartment was untouched. Bed made, dishes clean, no signs of a struggle. Rebecca's purse was gone, but her keys were sitting on the kitchen counter. That single detail, keys left behind, sent a chill through Carol that she would later describe as a mother's instinct that something was terribly wrong. Carol called the Milford Police Department at 1:47 p.m. on April 15th, roughly 16 hours after Rebecca had last been seen. The officer who took the call told Carol that adults go missing all the time, that Rebecca was probably with a friend or a boyfriend, and that she'd likely turn up in a day or 2. Carol insisted. She told the officer that Rebecca would never leave her keys, never miss work without calling, never disappear without a word. The officer said he'd file a report, but there wasn't much they could do right away. Carol hung up the phone feeling helpless and angry. She didn't know it then, but that phone call, and the dismissive response she received, would set the tone for everything that followed. The investigation into Rebecca Hollies' disappearance would be marked not by urgency or diligence, but by a slow, creeping indifference that would allow the truth to slip further and further out of reach. By the evening of April 16th, Rebecca had been missing for more than 48 hours, and the town was beginning to stir with concern. Carol, along with a group of Rebecca's friends and coworkers, printed hundreds of missing person flyers and plastered them across Milford. They went door to door, asking if anyone had seen her. They walked the route from the diner to her apartment over and over, scanning the sidewalks, the alleyways, the empty lots. And while the community mobilized, the Milford Police Department moved at a glacial pace. A detective named Marshall Cohen was assigned to the case. Cohen was a 15-year veteran, known around town as a steady, no-nonsense officer. But in the weeks that followed, his handling of Rebecca's case would raise questions that would linger for years. Because Detective Cohen, for reasons that would later be scrutinized and debated, seemed to approach Rebecca's disappearance not as a potential crime, but as an inconvenience. Cohen conducted his first formal interview with Carol Hollies on April 17th, 3 days after Rebecca vanished. According to Carol's later testimony, Cohen asked her about Rebecca's relationships, her mental health, whether she had any reason to run away. Carol answered every question with increasing frustration. She told Cohen that Rebecca was happy, stable, and excited about her future. She wasn't depressed. She wasn't in trouble. She wasn't the kind of person to just leave. Cohen nodded, took notes, and then asked Carol if Rebecca had been seeing anyone romantically. Carol mentioned that Rebecca had briefly dated a man named Travis Kern a few months earlier, but they'd broken up amicably and hadn't spoken since. Cohen wrote down the name. And then, inexplicably, he let the interview drift into small talk about the weather and the upcoming town festival. Carol left the station that day feeling like she hadn't been heard at all. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Rebecca Hollies began to lose momentum. Volunteers scoured the woods on the outskirts of town, checked abandoned buildings, dragged sections of the river. Nothing. Detective Cohen interviewed a handful of Rebecca's friends and coworkers, but his questioning was cursory at best. He spoke to Travis Kern, the ex-boyfriend Carol had mentioned, but the interview lasted less than 20 minutes. Kern said he hadn't seen Rebecca in months and had no idea where she might be. Cohen seemed satisfied with that answer. He didn't press further. He didn't verify Kern's alibi. He didn't follow up with anyone who might have seen Kern around the time Rebecca disappeared. In fact, according to case files that would later be reviewed, Cohen conducted only 7 formal interviews in the first month of the investigation. 7. For a missing person case in a town of fewer than 8,000 people, that number was staggeringly low. But there was something else, something that at the time seemed like just another dead end, but would later become the most important detail in the entire case. On April 18th, 4 days after Rebecca vanished, a man named Eugene Part, who lived 2 blocks from Rebecca's apartment, called the police. Eugene told the dispatcher that on the night of April 14th, around 9:30 p.m., he had been walking his dog when he saw a dark-colored pickup truck parked in the alley behind the hardware store where Rebecca lived. The truck's engine was running, and the driver was sitting inside, alone, smoking a cigarette. Eugene said the truck stayed there for at least 10 minutes before driving off. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but after seeing Rebecca's missing person flyers, he wondered if it might be relevant. The dispatcher took down Eugene's information and said someone would follow up. A report was filed. Eugene's statement was documented, and then, incredibly, nothing happened. Detective Cohen never contacted Eugene. He never asked for a description of the truck or the driver. He never went to the alley to look for tire tracks or cigarette butts. The lead was filed away and forgotten. As spring turned into summer, Carol Hollies became increasingly desperate. She called the police station almost every day, demanding updates, begging for answers. Cohen's responses were vague and non-committal. He told her the investigation was ongoing, that they were following every lead, that these things take time. But Carol could sense the truth. The case was going cold, and no one seemed to care. She hired a private investigator, a retired state trooper named Frank Delgado, to look into Rebecca's disappearance independently. Delgado reviewed the case file, interviewed witnesses Cohen had missed, and within 2 weeks he found something that stopped him cold. Travis Kern, the ex-boyfriend Cohen had so quickly dismissed, had a history that should have been a massive red flag from the start. And the fact that it hadn't been uncovered, or worse, had been deliberately ignored, was about to blow the case wide open. Frank Delgado discovered that Travis Kern had been arrested twice in the early 1990s for assault. One charge involved an altercation with a former girlfriend, the other a bar fight that left a man hospitalized. Both cases had been pleaded down to misdemeanors, and Kern had served minimal jail time. But the pattern was there, a history of violence, a temper that turned dangerous. Delgado interviewed the ex-girlfriend, a woman named Jennifer Lowe, who told him that Kern had been controlling, possessive, and prone to explosive outbursts. She said she'd broken up with him because she was afraid of what he might do. And here's where it gets even more troubling. When Delgado asked Jennifer if she'd ever spoken to the police about Kern in connection with Rebecca's disappearance, she said yes. She'd called Detective Cohen herself, just days after Rebecca went missing, and told him everything she knew about Kern's past. Cohen had thanked her for the information and said he'd look into it. But according to the case file, there's no record of that phone call. No notes, no follow-up. It was as if the conversation had never happened. Armed with this new information, Delgado took his findings to the Milford Police Department and demanded a meeting with Cohen. The meeting, which took place in late June of 1998, was contentious. Delgado laid out everything he'd uncovered: Kern's violent history, Jennifer Lowe's phone call, the lack of follow-up. He asked Cohen directly why these leads hadn't been pursued. Cohen's response, according to Delgado's later testimony, was defensive and evasive. He claimed that Kern's past was irrelevant because he'd had an alibi for the night of Rebecca's disappearance. Delgado asked what that alibi was. Cohen said Kern had told him he was home alone, watching TV. Delgado pointed out that being home alone isn't an alibi, it's an unverifiable claim. Cohen shrugged and said that without evidence linking Kern to the scene, there was nothing more he could do. The meeting ended with Delgado walking out in frustration and Cohen retreating further into his bubble of inaction. And Rebecca Hollies, wherever she was, remained missing. But here's where the story takes a turn that no one saw coming. On July 2nd, 1998, nearly 3 months after Rebecca disappeared, a pair of hikers stumbled across something in the woods about 12 miles outside of Milford. They'd been walking an unmarked trail when they noticed an unusual smell, sweet, sickly, unmistakable. They followed the scent to a shallow ravine, partially hidden by fallen branches and overgrowth. And there, lying face down in the dirt, was a body. The hikers called 911, and within an hour the area was swarming with police, forensic techs, and the county medical examiner. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, but certain identifying features were still visible: a tattoo on the left shoulder, a silver ring on the right hand. By that evening, the remains were positively identified as Rebecca Hollies. She had been found, but the nightmare was just beginning. The autopsy was conducted the following day by Dr. Alan Rourke, the county medical examiner. Dr. Rourke's report, which would later become a central piece of evidence in the case, revealed several critical findings. Rebecca had died from blunt force trauma to the head, multiple strikes, delivered with significant force, consistent with a heavy object like a tire iron or a metal pipe. The injuries were concentrated on the back and left side of her skull, suggesting she'd been struck from behind. But that wasn't all. Dr. Rourke also found ligature marks on Rebecca's wrists and ankles, indicating she'd been bound at some point before her death. And here's the detail that would haunt everyone involved. Based on insect activity and the rate of decomposition, Dr. Rourke estimated that Rebecca had been killed within 24 to 48 hours of her disappearance. That meant she'd likely been alive, somewhere, for up to 2 days after she vanished. 2 days during which a more aggressive, competent investigation might have made all the difference. The discovery of Rebecca's body turned the case into a full-blown homicide investigation, and suddenly, the spotlight was on the Milford Police Department, and specifically on Detective Marshall Cohen. Local reporters began asking hard questions. Why had the initial investigation moved so slowly? Why had obvious leads been ignored? Why had it taken a private investigator to uncover Travis Kern's violent history? The pressure mounted, and the department responded by bringing in the state police to take over the case. A senior investigator named Lieutenant Sarah Vance was assigned to lead the new team. Vance was methodical, thorough, and deeply unimpressed by what she found in Cohen's files. She later described the initial investigation as incomplete, disorganized, and negligent. But even Vance, with all her experience and resources, was about to discover just how deep the failures ran. Because the one piece of evidence that could have cracked the case wide open had been sitting in the evidence locker the entire time, and no one had bothered to look at it. Remember Eugene Part, the man who called in a tip about the dark pickup truck in the alley on the night Rebecca disappeared? His statement had been filed away and forgotten by Cohen. But when Lieutenant Vance reviewed the case, she found that tip and immediately recognized its potential significance. She tracked down Eugene and re-interviewed him in detail. Eugene described the truck as an older model, dark blue or black, with a dent in the rear fender. He couldn't see the driver's face clearly, but he remembered thinking the man looked bulky, broad-shouldered. Vance asked if Eugene would be willing to work with a sketch artist. He agreed. And when the sketch was completed, Vance showed it to several people who knew Travis Kern. 3 of them, including Jennifer Lowe, said the sketch bore a striking resemblance to Kern. But here's the problem: Travis Kern didn't own a dark pickup truck. According to DMV records, he drove a red sedan, so if it was Kern in that alley, whose truck was he driving? Vance's team began digging deeper into Travis Kern's life, and what they found was a web of connections that Cohen had never bothered to explore. Kern worked at a local auto repair shop, and one of his co-workers was a man named Dale Hutchins. Dale owned a dark blue 1989 Chevrolet pickup truck with a dented rear fender. When Vance interviewed Dale, he claimed he had no idea where his truck had been on the night of April 14th because, according to him, Kern had borrowed it. Kern had told Dale he needed to move some furniture and asked to use the truck for a few hours. Dale said he'd agreed without thinking much of it. Kern had returned the truck around midnight, thanked him, and that was that. But when Vance confronted Kern with this information, Kern's story began to fall apart. At first, he denied borrowing the truck. Then, when pressed, he admitted he might have, but couldn't remember for sure. Then he changed his story again, saying he'd used it to pick up some auto parts, not furniture. The inconsistencies were glaring, and Vance knew she was closing in on something. On August 10, 1998, Lieutenant Vance obtained a search warrant for Travis Kern's residence, a small house on the outskirts of Milford. The search yielded several items of interest: a metal tire iron with faint stains that would later test positive for blood, a roll of nylon rope consistent with the ligature marks on Rebecca's body, and a pair of work boots with soil samples that matched the dirt composition of the ravine where Rebecca had been found. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't found in Kern's house. It was found in Dale Hutchins's truck. Forensic techs discovered a single strand of hair lodged in the bed of the truck, caught in a crack near the wheel well. The hair was sent to the state lab for DNA analysis. 3 weeks later, the results came back. The hair belonged to Rebecca Hollies. Travis Kern was arrested on September 4, 1998, and charged with first-degree murder. Kern's trial began in the spring of 1999, and it was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Monica Sharp, laid out a compelling case. They argued that Kern had become obsessed with Rebecca after their breakup, that he'd been stalking her, and that on the night of April 14th, he'd waited for her in the alley behind her apartment. He'd abducted her, driven her to a remote location, assaulted her, and ultimately killed her in a fit of rage. The evidence, the tire iron, the rope, the hair in the truck, was overwhelming. Kern's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Gary Mendes, tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the hair could have been transferred innocently, that Kern had no motive. But the jury wasn't buying it. After just 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict. Travis Kern was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Carol Hollies, it was a bittersweet victory. Justice had been served, but Rebecca was never coming back. But the story doesn't end there. Because in the years that followed, troubling questions began to surface about the original investigation and about Detective Marshall Cohen's role in it. Journalists, lawyers, and even some within the police department started asking why so many obvious leads had been ignored, why Eugene Part's tip had been buried, why Travis Kern's violent history hadn't been uncovered sooner. And the more people looked, the stranger things became. In 2001, a local reporter named Emma Grayson filed a Freedom of Information Act request to obtain the complete case file from Rebecca's disappearance. What she received was shocking. Entire sections of the file were missing: interview notes, evidence logs, witness statements. Some pages had been redacted so heavily they were almost unreadable. Others appeared to have been removed entirely. It was as if someone had gone through the file and systematically scrubbed it of anything that might be incriminating. And the person with the most access to that file, the person who'd controlled it from the very beginning, was Marshall Cohen. Emma Grayson's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. She discovered that Travis Kern and Marshall Cohen had known each other long before Rebecca's disappearance. In fact, they'd gone to high school together in a neighboring town. They hadn't been close friends, but they'd been acquaintances, part of the same social circle. Cohen had even attended a few parties at Kern's house back in the late 1980s. This connection, which Cohen had never disclosed, raised an obvious and deeply troubling question. Had Cohen deliberately sabotaged the investigation to protect Kern? Had he buried leads, ignored evidence, and slow-walked the case because of some misplaced sense of loyalty or obligation? Emma confronted Cohen with these questions in an interview in 2002. Cohen denied everything. He claimed he didn't remember being friends with Kern, that any connection between them was ancient history and irrelevant. He insisted he'd done his job to the best of his ability, and that the failures in the case were simply the result of limited resources and bad luck. But his explanations were thin, unconvincing, and evasive, and the public wasn't buying it. In 2003, the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office launched an official inquiry into the handling of Rebecca Hollies' case. The inquiry was led by a special investigator named Daniel Frost, a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. Frost and his team spent 18 months re-examining every aspect of the original investigation. They interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, and combed through the incomplete case files. What they found was damning. Frost's final report, released in late 2004, concluded that Detective Marshall Cohen had failed to meet the basic standards of competent police work and had demonstrated a pattern of negligence, inaction, and possible misconduct. The report stopped short of accusing Cohen of deliberately obstructing the investigation, but it made clear that his failures had directly contributed to the delay in solving Rebecca's murder. And then came the bombshell. Frost's team had uncovered the one piece of evidence that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. The overlooked detail that could have changed everything from the very beginning. On April 15, 1998, the day after Rebecca disappeared, a patrol officer named Officer Rick Bellamy had been dispatched to check the alley behind Rebecca's apartment as part of the initial search efforts. Bellamy had walked the alley, looked around, and noticed a few cigarette butts on the ground near where Eugene Part later reported seeing the pickup truck. Bellamy, following standard procedure, had collected the cigarette butts and placed them in an evidence bag. He'd logged them into the evidence locker and noted their location in his report. But here's the thing, those cigarette butts were never tested. Not for DNA, not for fingerprints, not for anything. They sat in the evidence locker, sealed in a bag, for over 5 years. When Frost's team finally had them analyzed in 2004, they found DNA on 2 of the butts. And that DNA was a perfect match for Travis Kern. This wasn't circumstantial. This wasn't indirect. This was physical evidence placing Kern at the exact location where Rebecca was likely abducted, on the exact night she disappeared. If those cigarette butts had been tested in 1998, Kern could have been arrested within weeks. Rebecca's family could have had answers almost immediately. The case could have been solved before it ever went cold. So why weren't they tested? That's the question that haunted everyone involved. Daniel Frost's report offered a few possible explanations. Maybe Cohen simply overlooked them in the chaos of the investigation. Maybe he didn't think they were important. Or maybe, and this is the explanation that many people found most plausible, he deliberately chose not to pursue them because he knew where they would lead. In any case, the failure to test that evidence represented a catastrophic breakdown in the investigation. It wasn't just negligence. It was a betrayal of Rebecca Hollies, her family, and the entire community that had trusted the police to find the truth. Carol Hollies, speaking publicly after Frost's report was released, said that knowing her daughter's killer could have been caught so much sooner was almost more painful than losing Rebecca in the first place. She said it felt like Rebecca had been failed twice, once by the person who killed her, and once by the system that was supposed to protect her. Marshall Cohen was quietly forced into retirement in 2005. He never faced criminal charges for his role in the mishandling of Rebecca's case. There simply wasn't enough evidence to prove deliberate obstruction, but his reputation was destroyed. In interviews conducted years later, former colleagues described him as a man who'd been overwhelmed by the case, who'd made mistakes, who'd let his personal biases cloud his judgment. Some suggested he'd been burnt out, tired, and simply hadn't cared enough to do the work. Others hinted at something darker, a deliberate effort to protect Travis Kern, motivated by old loyalties or perhaps something even more troubling. Cohen himself disappeared from public view. He moved out of Milford, changed his phone number, and refused all requests for interviews. To this day, he has never publicly addressed the findings of Daniel Frost's report or explained why the cigarette butts were never tested. His silence speaks volumes. And for the people who loved Rebecca Hollies, it's a silence that echoes with the weight of unanswered questions and unresolved anger. The fallout from the Rebecca Hollies case led to significant reforms within the Milford Police Department and across Pennsylvania more broadly. New protocols were put in place for handling missing person cases, requiring faster response times, more thorough documentation, and mandatory evidence testing within specific timeframes. The state also established an independent review board to oversee cold cases and ensure that investigations were being conducted with competence and integrity. These changes were important, necessary, and long overdue. But for Carol Hollies and the others who'd fought so hard for justice, they felt like cold comfort. No policy change could bring Rebecca back. No reform could erase the years of frustration, grief, and betrayal. The system had failed Rebecca when she needed it most, and while it might work better for others in the future, that knowledge didn't ease the pain of what had been lost. Travis Kern, meanwhile, remains in prison. He has maintained his innocence since the day he was arrested, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Over the years, he's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. In a 2010 prison interview with a journalist, Kern claimed he'd been framed, that the DNA evidence had been planted, that he was the victim of a corrupt system. But his arguments have never gained traction. The evidence is simply too strong. The hair in the truck, the tire iron, the rope, the cigarette butts, each piece fits together into a picture that is undeniable. Kern killed Rebecca Hollies. He took her life in a moment of rage and control, and then he tried to disappear into the background, hoping the case would fade into obscurity. And for a while, thanks to Marshal Cohen's failures, it almost did. But the truth, as it so often does, eventually found its way into the light. But here's the question that still lingers, the one that keeps people awake at night, the one that refuses to be neatly answered. What if? What if Officer Bellamy's cigarette butts had been tested immediately? What if Detective Cohen had followed up on Eugene Part's tip? What if Jennifer Lowe's phone call had been documented and investigated? What if the system had worked the way it was supposed to? Would Rebecca Hollies still be alive? Probably not. She was likely killed within hours of being abducted. But would her family have had answers sooner? Would they have been spared months of agonizing uncertainty? Would Travis Kern have been caught before he had the chance to destroy evidence, to craft lies, to prepare his defense? The answer to those questions is almost certainly yes. And that's what makes this case so heartbreaking, so infuriating, so impossible to forget. The system didn't fail because it lacked the tools or the information. It failed because the people running it chose not to do their jobs. In the years since Rebecca's murder, her story has become a symbol, a reminder of what happens when justice is delayed, when incompetence masquerades as procedure, when the people entrusted with protecting us choose convenience over truth. Carol Hollies has dedicated much of her life to advocacy work, speaking at conferences, training sessions, and legislative hearings about the importance of thorough, compassionate, and competent investigations. She's helped pass laws requiring faster action on missing person cases and better oversight of police departments. She's turned her pain into purpose, her loss into a legacy. And while nothing can bring Rebecca back, Carol's work has ensured that her daughter's name will be remembered not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The alley where Rebecca was last seen has changed over the years. The hardware store where she lived is gone, replaced by a small boutique. The streetlights are brighter now, the sidewalks repaved. But if you walk that route at night, if you stand in the spot where Rebecca disappeared, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. The locals say they avoid that alley after dark, not because it's dangerous, but because it feels heavy. Haunted by the memory of a young woman whose life was stolen, and a system that failed to protect her. There's no plaque, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of what took place. Just the lingering sense that something terrible happened here, and that the people who should have stopped it didn't. Rebecca's grave is in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Milford, beneath a tree that blooms white flowers every spring. Carol visits often, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby, talking to her daughter the way she used to when Rebecca was alive. She tells her about the work she's doing, about the lives that have been saved because of the changes Rebecca's case inspired. She tells her that she's still fighting, still pushing, still refusing to let the world forget. And in those quiet moments, Carol says, she feels Rebecca's presence, a warmth, a comfort, a reminder that even in death, her daughter's light hasn't been extinguished. It's been transformed into something that shines for others, a beacon in the darkness, guiding the way toward justice. The Milford Police Department, for its part, has tried to move on from the scandal. New leadership has brought in fresh policies, better training, and a renewed commitment to transparency. The current chief, a woman named Captain Alina Torres, has publicly acknowledged the failures of the past and vowed that they will never be repeated. But trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Many in the community remain skeptical, wary of placing their faith in an institution that let them down so catastrophically. And that skepticism is understandable. Because the truth is, the failures in Rebecca's case weren't just about one bad detective or one mishandled investigation. They were symptomatic of a deeper rot, a culture that prioritized closing cases over finding truth, that valued appearances over accountability, that allowed mediocrity and misconduct to thrive in the shadows. There's a broader lesson here, one that extends far beyond Milford, far beyond Rebecca Holly's. It's a lesson about the fragility of justice, about how easily the truth can be buried when the people in power choose not to look for it. Every year, thousands of cases go cold. Missing persons, unsolved murders, disappearances that fade into obscurity. And for every case that gets solved, for every family that finds closure, there are dozens more that don't. Not because the evidence isn't there, but because someone along the way didn't care enough to find it. Rebecca's case is a reminder that justice isn't automatic. It doesn't happen simply because we want it to. It happens because people, investigators, advocates, journalists, families, fight for it, demand it, refuse to let it slip away. And when those people fail in their duty, when they choose indifference over diligence, the cost is measured in lives lost, families shattered, and communities scarred. One of the most haunting aspects of Rebecca's story is the what-if that hangs over everything, the realization that so much suffering could have been prevented. April 15th, Eugene's tip ignored. April 16th, cigarette butts collected but never tested. April 17th, Travis Kern's violent history overlooked. Each of these moments represented a fork in the road, a chance to change the outcome. And at each fork, the investigation chose the path of least resistance, the path that led away from the truth. It's impossible not to wonder how many other cases are out there right now, sitting in evidence lockers, buried in incomplete files, waiting for someone to care enough to look. How many families are living in the same agonizing limbo that Carol Holly's endured? How many killers are walking free because the system failed to do its job? The answer is unknowable, but the question itself is enough to keep you awake at night. Frank Delgado, the private investigator who first uncovered Travis Kern's violent past, has spoken publicly about the case many times over the years. In a 2015 interview, he said that Rebecca's case changed the way he thought about his work. He said it taught him that the most important evidence isn't always the most obvious, and that sometimes the biggest obstacle to justice isn't a lack of clues, it's a lack of will. Frank also spoke about the moment he realized the cigarette butts had never been tested. He said it felt like a punch to the gut, a betrayal of everything he believed the system was supposed to stand for. He said he'd worked alongside police officers his entire career, respected them, trusted them. But after Rebecca's case, he couldn't look at law enforcement the same way. It's hard, he said, to believe in a system that doesn't believe in itself. The media coverage of Rebecca's case was extensive, but it wasn't always fair or accurate. Some outlets focused on the more lurid details, the violence, the neglect, the scandal. Others turned Rebecca into a symbol, a talking point, a cautionary tale stripped of her humanity. But the people who actually knew Rebecca, her friends, her co-workers, her mother, remember her differently. They remember the way she laughed, loud and unrestrained, the way she could make anyone feel welcome with just a smile. They remember her dreams of becoming a nurse, her kindness, her resilience. They remember that she was a real person, not just a headline or a case number. And they've worked hard over the years to ensure that her memory isn't defined solely by the way she died, but by the way she lived. Because Rebecca Hollies was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with a future that was stolen from her, and she deserves to be remembered as such. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Lisa Monroe began work on a film about Rebecca's case. The documentary, titled The Evidence We Ignore, premiered at a film festival in 2014 and received critical acclaim for its unflinching examination of the failures in the investigation. Lisa interviewed Carol Hollies, Frank Delgado, Lieutenant Sarah Vance, and dozens of others connected to the case. She also tried to interview Marshall Cohen, but he refused. The film ends with a powerful sequence, Carol standing in the alley where Rebecca disappeared, speaking directly to the camera about the importance of never giving up, of demanding accountability, of refusing to let the system bury the truth. The documentary brought renewed attention to Rebecca's case and sparked conversations about police reform, evidence handling, and the need for greater oversight. It also served as a tribute to Rebecca herself, a reminder that behind every cold case is a human being who mattered, who was loved, and who deserves justice. The cigarette butts that sat untested in the evidence locker for over 5 years have become a symbol of everything that went wrong in Rebecca's case. They represent the laziness, the indifference, the failure of a system that should have done better. But they also represent something else, the resilience of truth. Because no matter how long those cigarette butts sat in the dark, no matter how many years passed, they never stopped holding the truth. And when the right people finally decided to look, when the right questions were finally asked, the truth came roaring back to life. That's the thing about evidence, it doesn't lie, it doesn't fade. It doesn't forget, it waits. And if we're willing to do the hard work to ask the uncomfortable questions, to hold the people in power accountable, the truth will always find a way to surface. Rebecca's case is proof of that. It's proof that justice, however delayed, is still possible. But it's also proof that justice doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people fight for it. Travis Kern's arrest in 1998 was just the beginning of a much longer reckoning. His conviction brought a measure of closure, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. Carol Hollies spent years battling the police department, demanding answers, seeking accountability. In 2007, she filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Milford, alleging that Detective Cohen's negligence had caused her and her family undue suffering. The case was settled out of court in 2009 for an undisclosed sum. Carol used the money to establish the Rebecca Hollies Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for better training and oversight in law enforcement. The foundation has helped dozens of families navigate the nightmare of a missing loved one, providing resources, support, and a voice when they feel unheard. It's a fitting legacy for Rebecca, a life cut short, but a light that continues to shine through the work her mother has built in her name. There's a phrase that often comes up in discussions about cold cases: the evidence doesn't lie. It's a comforting idea, the notion that physical evidence is objective, neutral, incorruptible. And in a technical sense, that's true. DNA doesn't change, fingerprints don't disappear, blood doesn't fade. But the evidence itself is only as good as the people who collect it, test it, and interpret it. In Rebecca's case, the evidence was there from the very beginning. The cigarette butts, the witness statements, the violent history, it was all there waiting to be discovered. But it took years for anyone to actually look, and that's the real problem. Evidence doesn't lie, but it also doesn't speak for itself. It needs advocates, Investigators, people who care enough to dig through the files, to ask the hard questions, to refuse to accept easy answers. Without those people, the evidence is just inert matter, locked away in a box gathering dust. One of the most painful revelations to come out of Daniel Frost's investigation was the sheer number of missed opportunities. Frost's team identified at least 9 separate moments during the initial investigation where different decisions could have led to a faster resolution. 9 moments where the case could have been cracked open. 9 moments where someone chose not to act. Some of those moments were the result of incompetence, mistakes, oversights, failures of judgment. Others seemed more deliberate, more calculated, and the cumulative effect of all those missed opportunities was devastating. They turned what should have been a straightforward investigation into a years-long ordeal that left a family in torment and a killer almost free. The weight of those missed opportunities is something that Carol Hollies carries with her every day. She said in interviews that she doesn't just mourn Rebecca. She mourns the justice that could have come sooner, the peace her family could have had, the years of pain that didn't need to happen. In 2018, 20 years after Rebecca's murder, the town of Milford held a memorial service in her honor. It was a quiet, somber event. No speeches, no politicians, no media circus. Just a small crowd of people who remembered Rebecca, who wanted to pay their respects, who refused to let her story fade into history. Carol was there, of course, standing at the front, holding a photograph of her daughter. She didn't say much, just thanked everyone for coming and asked them to remember Rebecca not as a victim, but as a person, a young woman with dreams, with kindness, with a life that mattered. At the end of the service, the crowd released white balloons into the sky, each one carrying a silent wish, a prayer, a promise to never forget. And as those balloons drifted upward, disappearing into the twilight, there was a sense, fragile but real, that maybe, just maybe, some measure of peace had finally been found. Rebecca Hollies' case is a story of many things: tragedy, injustice, resilience, and ultimately, truth. It's a story that reminds us of the importance of doing the work, of caring enough to look beyond the surface, of refusing to accept good enough when lives are on the line. It's also a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the systems we trust, about the people we rely on to protect us, and about what happens when those people fail. But most importantly, it's a story about Rebecca herself, a young woman who deserved better, who should still be here, who was failed by a system that didn't value her life enough to fight for it. And while we can't change what happened to Rebecca, we can honor her memory by demanding better, by holding the powerful accountable, by ensuring that the next Rebecca Hollies doesn't slip through the cracks. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about protecting the innocent, and when we fail at that, we fail at everything. As this story comes to a close, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned, not just about Rebecca's case, but about the nature of cold cases, about the fragility of justice, about the importance of evidence and advocacy and truth. The lesson is simple, but it's one that bears repeating. Nothing happens by accident. Justice doesn't come because we wish for it. The truth doesn't surface because we hope it will. It comes because people fight for it, because they refuse to give up, because they believe that every life matters and every victim deserves answers. Carol Hollies fought for her daughter. Frank Delgado fought for the truth. Lieutenant Sarah Vance fought to do the job that should have been done from the start. And together, they pulled Rebecca's story out of the darkness and into the light. Their work didn't bring Rebecca back, nothing could. But it gave her family closure, it brought a killer to justice, and it changed the system so that future families might not have to endure the same pain. That's not a perfect ending. But it's the best ending that was still possible, and sometimes that has to be enough. There's a box sitting in the Milford Police Department's evidence room right now. Inside that box are the cigarette butts that changed everything, the hair from the truck, the tire iron, the rope. They're all still there, preserved, cataloged, silent witnesses to a crime that was solved not because of flawless detective work, but because a few determined people refused to let the case die. That box is a reminder of what was lost, of what could have been prevented, of the cost of negligence and indifference. But it's also a reminder of something else. It's a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how long ignored, never truly disappears. It waits, and when the right people come looking, it reveals itself. Rebecca Hollies' story is over, but the lesson it teaches is eternal. Do the work, ask the questions, never stop searching for the truth. Because somewhere in some cold case file, in some forgotten evidence locker, there's another story waiting to be told. Another family waiting for answers. Another truth waiting to be found. And that truth is depending on us, on our diligence, our compassion, our refusal to look away. So don't, keep looking, keep questioning, keep fighting, because that's how justice happens. That's how the truth survives. That's how we honor the memory of people like Rebecca Hollies, by making sure their stories are never forgotten. This has been Critical Evidence in an Abandoned Police Cold Case, a vanished and found documentary. Rebecca's story is just one among thousands, stories of people who vanished, who were failed, who deserved better. And each one of those stories deserves to be told, to be heard, to be remembered. If this case has affected you, if it's made you think differently about justice, about accountability, about the importance of truth, then Rebecca's legacy lives on. Share her story. Demand better from the systems that are supposed to protect us. And never, ever forget that behind every cold case is a real person, a real family, and a real need for answers. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned, because next time we'll be investigating another mystery, another disappearance, another case where the truth was almost lost forever. But almost isn't the same as gone. The search continues.